Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening at the KHC in person, and to those of you joining us online. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College here at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Tonight's commemoration is entitled Rethinking Antisemitism in Our Times and features our keynote speaker, Dr. Magda Teter. We're very grateful to have the support of our local elected officials and senior administrators here at QCC. And so it's my great honor to begin this evening's program by introducing the president of Queensborough Community College, Dr. Christine Mangino.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, and good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Christine Mangino, president of Queensborough Community College, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this evening's important and timely event featuring our distinguished guest, Dr. Magda Teter, professor of history and the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University. Tonight, we commemorate the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. November 9 and 10, 1938, marked the first time the Jewish community experienced state-sponsored violence at the hands of the Nazis, culminating in widespread arrests, as well as the destruction of schools, businesses, synagogues, and cemeteries. This evening, we will reflect on the importance of rethinking how we study anti-Semitism. Queensborough's commitment to educating people about the Holocaust has taken on even greater significance amidst the scary rise in anti-Semitism around the world, including Friday's violence in Amsterdam and a week after the presidential election. It is also important to recognize that for many of us, this election is deeply personal, touching on core values and identities, and bringing real concerns about safety and survival. However we feel about the results, I hope comfort can be found in knowing that as a community, we will remain united in our shared mission. This moment underscores the critical role that institutions, educators, and individuals alike play in confronting all forms of bigotry, discrimination, and hate. At Queensborough, we will continue our work to keep our campus safe for our Jewish students, faculty, and staff, and we are committed to the Kupferberg Holocaust Center's work to make tangible connections between the Holocaust history and our present-day society in our collective effort to overcome the obstacles that lie ahead. That includes support from our local elected officials, including Queensborough President Donovan Richards and Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz, both of whom have sent in messages in solidarity.
Hi, I'm Queensborough President Donovan Richards, and on behalf of 2.4 million residents of Queens, I welcome you to tonight's commemoration of Kristallnacht. 86 years ago this month, hundreds of Jews were killed, tens of thousands were arrested, and countless homes, businesses, and synagogues were destroyed across Germany and Austria by the Nazis. This violence was a prelude to the Nazi murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. Nazi Germany lost the war, but the anti-Semitism that fueled them still rages to this very day. This begs the question as to what can be done to fight anti-Semitism in the modern era. And to answer that question, we must first define what modern anti-Semitism is. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center has been working to answer these questions. And on this anniversary of Kristallnacht, we come together for a critical conversation on how we study and define anti-Semitism in the 21st century. In light of last year's vicious attack against Israel by Hamas and the rise in anti-Semitism across the world, including here in America, this talk is needed now more than ever. If there is any hope of eliminating anti-Semitism, we must be effective in communicating its true evil nature to those vulnerable to its influence. So I thank the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for convening tonight's commemoration and discussion. And I hope tonight's event leads to further advances in the understanding of anti-Semitism and how to best combat it. By continuing to work together, we can build a world where the world's oldest form of hatred is finally a thing of the past. We say never again, never again, never again. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melinda Katz, and I am the DA for Queens County. It is an honor to join the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College for the annual Kristallnacht commemoration. Kristallnacht, often referred to as the Night of Broken Glass, is a chilling reminder of the violent consequences of rampant anti-Semitism across the globe. The violent riots against European Jewish communities in November of 1938 resulted in the destruction of hundreds of synagogues and Jewish institutions, with an estimated 7,500 Jewish-owned establishments being shattered and looted. Jewish cemeteries became a particular object of desecration in many regions. At least 91 Jews were killed, while another 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. The harrowing legacy of these tragic events serve as a stark reminder of the consequences of inaction. It is our duty to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself. As the Queens DA, I stand in solidarity with our Jewish communities, affirming our collective responsibility to confront and eradicate anti-Semitism in all forms. In light of the recent rise in anti-Semitism, 55% of the hate crimes in the borough of Queens County are because of anti-Semitism, and it was following the terrorist attack against Israel. It is more crucial than ever we unite against hate. The mission of my office extends beyond acknowledgement. We are dedicated to combating misinformation and work every day to protect the Jewish community from all threats of violence, harassment, vandalism, and assault. From drawing swastikas on local synagogues to vandalizing public parks and memorials to even horrific assaults on our Jewish neighbors, every case of a hate crime in this borough against any Queens resident will be investigated whenever possible and prosecuted appropriately. We take this seriously because 86 years later, events like Kristallnacht continue to signify the tragic consequences of silence in the face of unmitigated hatred. And so let us reaffirm our values that every person, no matter their race, background, religion, or language, is created equal and deserves to be treated as such throughout their lives. With education, activism, and a shared vision of protecting our Jewish neighbors, we will continue to combat anti-Semitism in order to realize a safer, more inclusive Queens. Thank you.
My sincerest thanks to President Mangino, Queensborough President Donovan Richards, and Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz. Our event this evening is co-sponsored by the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Sam and Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and the Holocaust and Genocide Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University. We're also grateful for the support of our QCC colleagues who are integral to producing the KHC's first hybrid event, including Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer Stephen DiDio, Barana Soman, the KHC's Administrative Coordinator, the Media Services, IT, Marketing, and Public Safety teams, including Mark Rapufka, Jesse Pina, Phil Roncaroni, Maher Hossein, and Public Officer Singh. After Dr. Teter's presentation, we'll host a short Q&A session, and for those of you watching online, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, please join me in welcoming this evening's esteemed speaker, Dr. Magda Teter, who is a professor of history and the Shvidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University. She's the author of Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Anti-Semitism and Racism, and of dozens of articles in English, Hebrew, Italian, and Polish. Dr. Teter's essays have also appeared in the New York Review of Books, Public Seminar, the JTA, and others. Her book, Blood Libel, won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award, the George Moses Prize for the American Historical Society, and the Ronald Bainton Prize for the 16th Century Society. Dr. Teter has received fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the H.F. Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University, the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and others. She's currently president of the American Academy of Jewish Research and one of the scholars consulted on President Biden's national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. Dr. Teter, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great, can you hear me or do I have to hold it? Okay. Thank you so much for this invitation and for being here. It's a great honor to be in this really remarkable space. It's a beautiful space, but a very somber space commemorating a really painful part of our history, of global history. It's shared history. The trauma of the Holocaust is something that we still feel we feel legacy of. I will start by saying that I wish we were not talking about anti-Semitism. I wish that we were in the times where we could just say, oh, this is the history, and you can go through the exhibition, and that's the past, that it was in the past. But as we all know, it's alive and sadly quite well. So discussing anti-Semitism is something that is unpleasant and painful and sometimes even controversial. And then when I teach with my class with my students, I tell them, we will read a lot of nasty stuff. We will read a lot of horrible things. We will see a lot of really offensive images, and we also will read scholarship that interprets that, with which we will agree or we won't agree. And the point of it, and I think that's part of our era, is that we look for affirmation or condemnation, affirmation or rebuttal, and we're unable to actually speak to each other, to learn from each other, well, even maybe disagreeing with each other, right? So I always tell my students, the success of our class will be if every class you leave with a new thought. So this is my hopefully challenge to you, that hopefully we will all leave with a new thought. From the talk, from our discussion, all of us will come out of it thinking something new. All the speakers before talked about what Kristallnacht was, so I will not repeat it. But I just wanted to show you the map of the destruction of attacks on those 2 nights in Nazi Germany. But Kristallnacht was only an escalation. It was new in the way that the state power came behind it, but it was an escalation. We've heard about the destruction of the synagogue, which you could see in all these dots, and Jewish businesses and centers and communities. It was something new, and yet something also that grew on of something else. It was an escalation. This is a chart from the Jewish Museum in Berlin called Topography of Violence that shows you that before Kristallnacht, there had already been 4,660 documented attacks on Jewish communities. And after the Anschluss, you have the picture here of Austrian Nazis forced Jews to scrub the streets and write anti-Semitic writings. You can see here an image showing, this is referring to the deportations of many Jews into the Dachau, arrested Jews into the Dachau concentration camp, over a Jewish store saying a Jew and on vacation in Dachau. You can see this contempt, the sneering, the humiliation that's at play. And I want us to think about those words. And now we are here. We've seen in the last several years escalation and anti-Semitic rhetoric, anti-Semitic acts on the right and the left, synagogues again attacked, Jewish stores tagged and vandalized. And unfortunately, it's not history. But is it the same, right? Is it the manifestation of the oldest hatred? And I'll talk a little bit of that idea of anti-Semitism as oldest, or is it different? Are we in a different place? Scholars have argued for the first book on the history of anti-Semitism was published in 1890s, right? So for over 130 years, writers and scholars have been trying to figure out what anti-Semitism is. And they asked these questions. Is the hatred and rejection of both Jews and Judaism known as anti-Semitism since the last quarter of the 19th century the same phenomenon throughout history? Is it the same? Is it different? But if we think this is the same thing, the longest hatred, that Jews have always been hated, where does it leave us, right? And here, Hannah Arendt, in her controversial book, Origins on Totalitarianism, flagged this as a problem. If the doctrine of eternal anti-Semitism, in the doctrine of eternal anti-Semitism, she wrote, Jewish hatred is normal and natural, and the outbursts of violence and need no explanation, right? They seem to be natural consequences of an eternal problem. And if that is natural, if it's always been there, we don't need an explanation, Jews have always been hated, then, as she says, this gives the best possible alibi for all horrors to anti-Semites. As she wrote, if it is true that mankind has insisted on murdering Jews for more than 2,000 years, then Jew killing is normal and even human occupation, and Jew hatred is justified beyond the need of an argument. Ooh, this hits us like a big brick, but because we are so used to thinking about the anti-Semitism, and we see it through these echoes, right? I show you the stores, the damaged stores in the Kristallnacht and the tagged stores now, that it seems that it's easy to turn to that. But that is also problematic. It offers no explanation and offers almost a justification. So the two quotes I showed you is also illustrate this sort of bewildering scholarship on anti-Semitism. I don't know how many of you have read books on the history of anti-Semitism, but there are many. There are, as I said, 130 years worth of that. And the scholars and writers have been essentially grappling with the questions. What is anti-Semitism, right? Because again, we have a dilemma of the longevity and modernity. It starts with modern. The word itself is modern, invented in towards the end of the 19th century. So they ask where it begins. Is it eternal? Is it modern? Arendt argued it was modern. Other historians said, but look at all the medieval stuff. They argue about spelling, about whether there's anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and all those things. And as I've been teaching and writing about it, I found it very frustrating. I found it doesn't get us anywhere. And I asked myself, do these matter? And my students were also confused about these questions. So then I thought about comparison, and this is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who visited the Warsaw Ghetto, but he also previously in the 19th century and early 20th century visited Europe and encountered anti-Semitism. And he wrote that visiting and seeing it didn't necessarily help him understand the Jewish problem, but it helped him understand the problem that he was concerned with, that is the situation of Black Americans, and he saw it in a different light. So for me, the moment of comparison, the moment where I pulled out of the sort of all the writings about anti-Semitism in all the field came when I watched a film by Raoul Peck about James Baldwin in 2016. It was premiered, I Am Not Your Negro. And in that documentary, they pull out a clip from James Baldwin's participation in the program, PBS program, The Negro and the American Promise, in which he challenged white America to think about why they invented the caricature of a Black person, right? The N-word. He uses very explicitly the N-word. And he says, I'm not this. I'm a man, I'm a human being, but there is this caricature. And as I watched this, I said, oh, this is like the Jew. The caricature of the Jew has nothing to do with the living and breathing people with full and rich lives, as you can see here in the exhibit right there. It is an invented image. And that reminded me about this quote from 1936. Again, another early book on anti-Semitism, in which Hugo Valentin says, it is not the Jews that are hated, but an imagery image of them, which is confounded with reality, and the Jews' actual faults play very unimportant role in that matter, right? It's just imagined. So I started reading and thinking about it more. It struck me that, oh, this is something to think about, right? That was the new thought I had watching that film and seeing this para. And then I started reading. I started reading more about Black history, American history, and I began to see these strange parallels. So when I was reading about the Missouri debate and the primary sources of the debate, the congressional debate, I noticed this passage about the discussion about who is the we the people, who belongs to the we the people, and one of the representative of Virginia objected that a constitution cannot possibly mean all these people, all the Indians, free Negroes, and all those. It was clearly we, the white people, right? And that reminded me about the debates about citizenship and admission of Jews to citizenship in 18th century Europe. And the question was whether, and this is from the Netherlands, whether we in the Netherlands honor the rights of men or only of Christian men, the rights of citizens or only Christian citizens. Right? It asks the question, do we continue to regard the Jewish people as alien residents, or will we go further and regard them as Dutchmen? Can they be on equal footing as Dutchmen? And then someone says, like Barbara of Virginia, collectively speaking, Jews cannot share in our social rights as citizens as long as they are Jews, right? And I could give you a ton of those examples, right, of parallels in those debates. Here is another example, again, of the rejection of Jews as equal citizens that parallels that awful Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott case, right, that asked the question whether a Negro can become a member of a political community entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizen. And here you have from the Revolutionary era the question whether does the law of Moses make citizens and full integration of Jews impossible, and some argued that yes, the wisdom of the legislative body in Paris after the French Revolution the imperative law not to grant to Jews, whom we must always consider as foreigners among us, the equality and the rights of French citizens, right? So I kept reading, and I kept coming up with the list of these eerie parallels. They are different, but nonetheless they are similar. So in the Ibrahim X. Kendi book, Stamped from the Beginning, he talks about this sort of argument that black people were not ready to become emancipated or even citizens because they were not ready, because they needed improvement. And again, that reminded me about this argument that Jews cannot become yet citizens of these European nations because of all the persecutions. They're simply not ready to be citizens. They need to reform themselves, right? There was a book called On the Civil Improvement of the Civil Betterment of Jews, that they need to first become better before we admit them to citizenship. And as I was encountering that, I started making a list. I started making a list of these eerie, uncanny parallels. Okay. Can we? I went too far. Okay. And this is my list. And I noticed that Jews, I knew from my scholarship that Jews were contrast figures that were very important, constitutive of Christian identity, that Christianity couldn't exist without its relationship with Judaism. And by contrast, the history of white identity, European white identity in particular, emerged from the context of the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, and thing. And I'll just show you a couple of examples. Why is it not? Can I just use this here okay. So here is the example of the contrast figures, right? The synagogue representing Judaism as this humiliated, blindfolded woman against the ecclesia, symbolizing Christianity as this Christian queen, standing assertively up. And in the modern times, this is actually a Nazi children's book. The caricatured Jew, who is also racialized as darker, and against the Aryan German man, who is, again, you can see this contrasting figure. Here is an image from an illustration from Dickens's Oliver Twist novel, and this is the Fagin, the Jewish character, and this Christian girl, and you can see that aesthetic contrast between the ugliness and the sort of menacing image of the Jewish man, of Fagin, and the Christian girl. And now notice the parallel of the aesthetic representation of the girl, because we see it around the same time in America, and representation and contrast to black people. And here you have the ugly, the sort of caricature of what Baldwin was talking about. And here you have a contrast again between the black person and the white person, and Christ as showing in that parallel. Both were perceived as lazy, but Jews were lazy because they were exploitative. They made money out of money, and they didn't really work, and that's sort of centuries of language. And in America, black people were seen as lazy because they were lazy at the expense of a white man, and you can see that difference here. But the parallel, they were both considered carnal and sexually threatening. And you can see here a series of images from the 19th century, late 19th century, until the bottom one here, the largest one, is from the Nazi children's book, of showing this sort of lecherous Jewish man, lecherous Jew. And here you have from the same period this parallel imagery and visual language of the lecherous black man. As we've seen, they are represented as ugly. There's this idea of Jews being arrogant. If they ask for anything, if they protest, they are arrogant, they are insolent. And then, of course, we also have this trope of the uppity black person. And we historically been talking about the Jewish question, the Jewish problem, and also the Negro pogrom. And here I want to show you a slide of these contemporary parallels, right? And it comes both from the Jewish question, a Jewish problem, from both anti-Semitic writings, but also from Jewish writings that are trying to explain the Jewish problem. And you see the parallel in that. And the question is, of course, whose problem is it? And the idea of fear of the persons in power, right? Jewish power, and I'll talk a little bit more how that trope, the anti-Semitic trope, emerges in this way. And ultimately, as we've seen in the quotes about citizenship, it's the refusal to accept both as equal in a state, in a polity. So how do we get in that? So I felt that this needed an explanation, that people with such drastically different histories as a people, it's uncanny that there are these parallels. And we know that some of the tropes, the anti-black tropes, anti-black racism come from slavery, where Jews, of course, were not enslaved, except for the story that leads to Passover celebration in the book of Exodus, and of course the Nazi era where Jews were enslaved in that. But historically, Jews were not enslaved. So why do we have such parallels? So I began to think about it because it needed an explanation, and I looked at the language of hierarchy, social hierarchy, and power. And already in the early Christian texts, we see they are not anti-Semitic. I don't want anybody to leave with that. But they have an embedded hierarchy of values that slowly gets attached to Jews and makes Jews inferior. So here in this passage from the epistle to Galatians, Paul, who was Jewish, but who was struggling to define his new faith in an era where Jews still had their own state in Judea, where they had the temple in Jerusalem, and he was trying to understand his new belief, and he put it in contrast of law or the Torah or commandments against faith in Jesus. And he began to associate it, law and the Torah, with Mount Sinai, this now with present-day Jerusalem, that is the temple that was still accepting sacrifices, and he tied it to slavery. He said this is that represents a slave woman, right? This is a parable of two commandments, two sons that Abram had, Isaac and Ishmael, one from a slave woman, one from a free woman. And he says the one from a slave woman was by the flesh, and she represents Mount Sinai and the law, essentially. And the free woman, that is Sarah, a promise. And that's the heavenly Jerusalem. And he talks about the children of the flesh, and he casts Jews and Judaism as the children of the flesh, and Christians as the children of the promise. And then he uses, in a theological passage about what we might call now predestination, the phrase from the book of Genesis, the elder shall serve the younger. I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau. And this will come back. And that trope, that sort of contrast that Paul sets up with this hierarchy of values, gets embedded in Christian theology. And as Christianity spreads, that kind of problem with Jews it has spreads across the globe. So even though Jews are this tiny little people, a tiny dot in Judea, and now just about 14, 15 million, they are much bigger in people's heads because they are so central to Christian identity and the Christian writing. So here, Augustine in the 3rd century, 5th century, picks up on Paul's hierarchy and talks about the two covenants, the old and the new, the earthly and the heavenly, one in servitude, the other one free. One, again, the city, the light in light, the other one in shadows. One, the one in blue, associated with Judaism and Jews, the other one with Christianity that has this. So again, the idea of these values. And then he explains, now when Augustine writes, the Roman Empire is already a Christian empire. So they have the state, the laws now. It's not just an issue of theology. And he says, as to the statement, the elder shall serve the younger, scarcely anyone among us has understood it to mean anything else than the elder people of Jews should serve the younger Christian people. Right? What could be clearer than the reference to these two promises, that to the people of Israelites and to the whole world, the former according to flesh, the other according to faith. You can see the flesh thinking about those carnal Jews that we were talking about earlier. And now you see the hierarchy, the power dynamic. One should serve the other, one should be above the other. And when the Christianity becomes an empire, they begin to issue laws that do exactly that. And that is what I call Christian supremacy, and I call it in a technical sense the power of the state, the authority of the state. So here you have one of the first laws that prohibited Jews from owning Christian slaves. The Roman Empire was a slave empire in a different way than the colonial empires, but Jews could not own Christian slaves. They could own slaves, but not Christian slaves, and Christians could own Christian slaves. But this is the first time when law singles out Jews for discrimination or for it removes rights in some way. And then this enters the sort of legal fabric of Western world, Christian world, in which constantly Jews are not reminded that they cannot own Christian slaves, but know that now we have the language of power, that Jews should not be permitted to hold a Christian slave in his power, and anybody found in them should be free. So that freedom and Christianity is now applied to law. And then it's translated also to prohibition for Jews to hire Christians as well, because that would change that power dynamic. And then Jews are excluded from public office. Then they are prohibited from practicing law and being in state service. That's something similar, I think, that you might see even in the exhibition later on in that way. Why couldn't they be in public service? Because of the Christians might think that because of this mastery, Jews are superior and they might convert to Judaism. And Jews should not be appointed judges over Christian population or be tax collectors, lest Christians be subjected to them, subjection, that power dynamic. There was also prohibition on intermarriage and prohibition of, again, is admitting Jewish witnesses against Christians. So very clear social hierarchy that was theological hierarchy is now enforced by law, right? And what Nazis did is they used law to remove rights from Jews. So the idea of law is very important here. And look at this language from the medieval period. That idea of slavery and Jews as slaves begins to permeate the Western European thinking about Jews. So they are not slaves, as I said, they were not enslaved, but the language of slavery is applied to them, right? So here Pope Innocent IV says, like, Jews by their guilt are consigned to perpetual servitude because they crucified their Lord, and they ought to be not to be ungrateful. And then he asks the rulers to restrain the excesses of Jews so that they shall not dare raise their neck bowed under the yoke of perpetual slavery against the reverence of Christian faith, lest the children of the free woman should be slaves to the children of the free woman, right? And they were rejected as slaves by God. So, and Jews should not dare grow insolent. That language comes out. And it is repeated again and again about that it is absurd that a blasphemer of Christ should exercise authority over Christians, right? Prohibiting Jews from public offices. Jews were consigned in ghetto. Here is a papal bull consigning Jews in ghetto in Rome, and said, why does he do it? Because Jews' guilt consigned them to perpetual servitude, and they should not exchange the servitude they owed to Christian for dominion over them. But Jews erupted in insolence. What's the insolence? They lived nice lives. They had normal lives like Roman citizens. They lived side by side with Christians. They wore normal clothes, no distinct habits. They were not marked. Nobody could tell that they were Jews. They had nice homes in noble sections of town. They had real estate. They had nurses, and they had servants. They lived lives like Romans. And the Pope didn't like it because Jews were supposed to be confined to perpetual servitude. So what does he do? He sends them to the ghetto. But look how he phrases it. He says, it is therefore appropriate that as long as they persist in their errors, they should recognize through experience that they have been made slaves while Christians have been made free through Christ. And then they are confined into ghetto, and there are limitations of what jobs they can have, what they can do. So think about that again, contempt and humiliation I showed you earlier when I was gesturing to the Kristallnacht events. And in modern times, you see that here, we've seen it obviously in the Kristallnacht images, but here is a quote from 1945 from a Polish bishop speaking to the Jewish leaders, asking him to do something about anti-Semitism against the survivors. And he says, well, you Jews are so talented, why don't you just help us rebuild Poland? Why do you engage in politics, right? Jews are sometimes in positions of authority because they are in the government, in parts of the government. Can you imagine what it looks like when a priest comes to the ministry and a Jewish woman is sitting there, God knows from where, and treats our clergy with superiority and insolence? That sort of reversed social order, right? And here's an anti-Semitic postcard which shows that reversed social order that is unacceptable to that. And that's why those images of making Jews wipe floors or were a point to humiliate them, to show them their place that we saw in the Kristallnacht imagery. Visual language, historic visual language. Judea capta, when Romans capture Judea, you have the victorious Roman soldier over this humiliated woman represented as Judea. We've seen the synagogue and ecclesia, ubiquitous imagery throughout the medieval and until the 18th century. But interestingly, when the Europeans expand into the colonial empires, the ecclesia, the church, the queen, changes her identity from a church to Europa. She is still a Christian queen. She's holding globe with the church, but she's no longer dominating the synagogue, the Jews and Judaism. She's now dominating the other continents, and you can see that in this image. And again, that becomes a very ubiquitous imagery in art and in sort of typology of representation of continents. Here you have the Queen Europa against these other continents. And by the 18th century, Africa is actually represented as black. It didn't used to be shown as black. And liberty continues in the modern period to continue as this white woman representing freedom. And remember that Christianity and freedom are tied together. Interestingly, the representation of America changes as well once the United States comes into being. America is no longer the savage woman, but now it's this Columbia, very much drawing on that iconography I showed you earlier. And legal, in the United States, in legal terms, you can see that echo of the laws that were used concerning Jews in the Roman Empire and now are used here against non-white people, the people of color, but also Jews and Muslims, who are prohibited from owning any Christian servant except of their own complexion. So it's a long race. And if they purchase any Christian white servant, that Christian white servant should become free. So again, that Roman law that was developed in terms of that in the Roman period against Jews is now applied more broadly in the colonies. So when the modern, as we've seen in those sort of quotes earlier about what citizenship is, of course in the modern era, the idea is that we're all equal, we're born equal, right? All men are created equal, or all men are born equal, depends which side of the Atlantic we're using the text from. And that clashed. That ideal of equality clashed with those centuries of thinking and social hierarchy and laws that meant to humiliate Jews and, of course, were enslaving people here, black people here in the colonies. And as we've seen, they were debating whether they belonged to that new we, and they were really connecting these two ideas, except that Jews were seen in religious terms and not racial terms yet. But you can see it here that that this discussion over citizenship is compared to the discussion of citizenship and of slaves in San Domingo in the French colony. And again, the discussion of the same parallels thing, whether the liberty is for white men only or the idea of human rights was discovered for Christian world alone, right, in Europe, excluding Jews from the idea of human rights. And eventually both Jews and black people earn citizenship according to law about the same time. You can see the dates. This is another very eerie parallel that it's chronologically it works even though it doesn't relate to each other. But it doesn't mean equality, right? It didn't mean acceptance. We know that there was immediate backlash here in the United States with Jim Crow laws after the Reconstruction failed. And in Europe, it was the rise of political and racial anti-Semitism. It was a backlash against Jewish equality. It was a backlash of Jews as equal citizens. And you can see here in the work by the men who popularized the word anti-Semitism, and the word anti-Semitism was actually popularized to make anti-Jewish hostility acceptable, because the Germans Jew hatred. No, we don't hate Jews. Jews are our neighbors. So they invented that language of anti-Semitism to make it more abstract. So people would find, oh, well, who are Semites? Semites, yeah, anti-Semitism is fine. So here is his quote where he where he talks about this, really the reaction against Jewish citizenship, political participation, voting rights, and all that. And he sees it as an alien domination. And he asks Germans, do not berate Jews, but do not elect them. Do not make them your legislators and judges, right? Again, you can think about that history of exclusion of Jews from public office. And then another intellectual, and this is actually very important because anti-Semitism gets credibility because university professors begin to accept it and begin to talk about it and begin to disseminate it. So here's a historian, a German historian, Heinrich von Treitschke, who is again pushing back against Jewish civil rights and equality. It was called emancipation at the time. And he says Jews insisted boldly on their certificate. They demanded literal parity. But they were forgetful of the fact that we Germans are, after all, a Christian nation, and Jews are only a minority, right? And he said, well, Jews will always be nothing but German-speaking Orientals. So he racializes them and makes them non-European, those who were the German Jews. And that sort of orientalization of Jews, or what I call in my book, de-Europeanization of European Jews, goes through religion. The European scholars are studying different religions of the world and put Jews in Palestine. They say, well, that's where Judaism is. Look at those Jews. They were so primitive. They had animal sacrifices just like these primitive people around the globe. So, and here, in fact, you have a book from the 18th century comparing Jews to East Indians and their practices. Here is an enchantment of the serpents. And of course, in the anti-Semitic postcards, you have that, Jews don't, as a result, because they're Oriental Semites now, they don't belong to Europe, to Germany. And that's a number of postcards from the turn of the century promoting the expulsion of Jews from Germany to Palestine. And here is a postcard from France, and that you can see again by the caricatures on the one on the, I guess, right here, or on the screen it's on the left. The Jew is this caricatured person, but he's holding a naturalization document. And the presumably French worker says, you will never be naturalized. You can never be a Frenchman, right? There's this rejection of that. So in the end, even though Jews and black people were equal citizens before law, or were citizens before law, that equality was seen as unearned, as invasive, as usurped position, as too powerful in that way. So that's for me, it helped me organize the confusion of all the scholarship in the, that is not about hatred necessarily. It's about power, it's about domination, it's about contempt, it's about humiliation. And the reason why it was so similar between these racist anti-black troops is because of the language of servitude and slavery that is embedded in the Christian thinking about Jews. And this then legal hierarchy that it created, and therefore it created habits of thinking about Jews as inferior, as not deserving something, right? That they should be punished by God, and they should, by experience that inferiority. And that trope of Jewish power, and is that Jews have too much, they have too much power, too much money, too much influence, comes out of that centuries-old language of Jews as inferior, as owing servitude to the dominant cultures, right? And in the black case, it's slightly different because obviously they were really enslaved, but it also triggers those habits of thinking about inferiority. So for me, coming from the outside, like for W.E.B. Du Bois, looking at something else helped me kind of see my own field that I thought I knew so well with better clarity, or at least let me think that it's about emotion, but it's about different emotion, and it allowed me to contextualize it. So it allowed me to think that it's not Jews that were always hated, and therefore it's normal, because again, as Hannah Arendt told us, that's a dangerous proposition. But it allowed me to think that we may need to rethink our approaches to this, how we study and teach anti-Semitism. And let me give you some thoughts about that, final thoughts. So anti-Semitism studies the perpetrators, right? Very rarely do we actually hear Jewish voices. Here we have about Jewish lives, but it's about those images, it's about those texts, it's about the anti-Semites, it's about that hostility. Scholars of anti-Semitism seek to expose these anti-Semitic ideas, to say, like, look, people, look, do something about it. This is outrageous. And they focus on emotion. And again, emotion is very difficult to counteract and explain and deal with. Think about how racism is taught and understood. It focuses on the victims of racism, on what racism does to people, right? That's why I showed you that image of Ruby Bridges. We can think about Ruby Bridges. We know what this man, this little girl, and sort of immediately can think about the human experience. There is a reluctance to publish racist images and texts, right? That's why Baldwin, when he used the N-word, he knew it was a reluctance because he wanted to make a point about it. And it focuses on the policies about what racism does, not what racism is, right? So all those definitions, people just argue about definitions. No, I mean this, you include that. And we forget the people who are affected by anti-Semitism. We forget the human experience of what anti-Semitism does when we argue about what anti-Semitism is. And that's, for me, what this kind of getting out of my comfort zone into a field that I didn't really know too much about, but I had to read for a few years about, gave me a little bit more clarity and made me rethink anti-Semitism for our time, because I feel that we've kind of failed this given what's happening. And I've revised my syllabus, and I want my students to think about the human beings and not just about what anti-Semites think about or imagine the human beings being. So I'll stop here. Is there hope? I think if we talk about it, this is an image of a sculpture from a Catholic University, St. Joseph's in Philadelphia, which reconceptualized that hierarchical synagogue and ecclesia into the two women learning from each other and talking to each other. And it might be a nice metaphor for our times where we need to look at each other and learn from each other and see each other as these two women now looking at each other's texts. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you and also having you make me think new thoughts. Thank you very much. Affirmation. I'm here to answer questions and listen to your responses on your thoughts. And if you have any new thoughts, that would be wonderful to hear.
So my question is, I really appreciate you doing this deep dive, especially in thinking about the language around racism, the history around anti-Semitism. And with so much, and we've kind of in our conversations been discussing the complexity of this moment. When you start talking with students and community members, what are some of the things you wish would enter into the conversation about anti-Semitism sooner than where it starts now?
So I think the understanding that this anti-Semitic trope of Jewish power and influence actually comes out of the language and legal structures of subjugation, that it is the reminder, and it is a really pernicious and an effective trope, because when Jews protest, then they're arrogant and insolent. And they have so much power, and yet they complain, right? And the understanding that deeper dynamic of where it's coming from, that it's coming out of the subjugation and the effort to subjugate and punish, that I think that's the missing piece. That is really, I think, shaped by, for our students, is shaped by the post-war experience of relative success of Jews in the United States. But that also begs the question why Jews as a minority, a successful minority, why their success is questioned and challenged, why they are still in the pattern of thinking of too much, which again, I think it's sort of carried without thinking about the deep past in the language and in thinking about Jews.
Do any of you have a question who are here in person?
Oh, I don't need a mic. Yes, you do. There are many minorities that are successful in this country, and they're persecuted as well. And I mean, Asian Americans are beaten up on the streets of Manhattan. And I think it seems to be a parallel of when there are successful minorities, they are singled out as being other than Americans.
Yes, that's a very important point. That especially in the last years, you had the singling out of Asian minority as this again model minority, and that has been challenged and then attacked. I am not sure whether, and I haven't, and again, this is not my field, so I will defer if you have that. I haven't heard the sense of they have too much, right? That is, maybe they are disproportionately represented, and there are all these challenges, but there's no kind of sense that they don't deserve, if they've earned that through studying, through work or something. And then in the language and the thinking about Jews, there's this too much trope again, and I think it comes out of that they don't deserve it, because again, theologically, they were always supposed to be in that lower level. And again, I focused on Christian Western world, but the Roman Empire bequeathed some of the legal structures and laws to the Islamic world. So Jews and Christians, non-Muslims, other non-Muslims were regarded as dhimmi, that is protected minority, but that had to be on an inferior status. So that sort of inferiority was in the Islamic law as well. So I think that plays a very crucial role in the way Jews are perceived. And think about even that whole debate over Governor Josh Shapiro, whether he could or should or not be a vice president, and the anxiety that some people felt, like, what is it going to mean? And again, I don't think people think Roman law, right? But that centuries of repeated legal system of Jews are not allowed to be in public offices, that they don't, I think it's a legacy, it's a sort of unthinking legacy, unconscious legacy that is carried through language and that we're not aware of while we are using these terms. Yes. That was first, and then you...
I just have a question that comes up recently on the situation we're now in. Is anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiment all anti-Semitic? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, it's a great and important question. And I think when you think about, when we move away from that emotional discourse and we think about how this thing functions in that way, and we look at Jewish history and the legal structures, and then you can begin to look at Israel and perhaps look at its legal system and its policies, and you can have a debate and you can disagree and you can criticize, right? When you move into that wholesale negation, then you are no longer discussing particular issues, you are eliminating something. And that when you are essentially denying and erasing the validity of Israel's right to existence as the only country you might be arguing for that erasure, that might be anti-Semitic, right? So I would always ask students to do a check, like check boxes. Are there any other countries you think shouldn't exist? Are there any other countries that commit, discriminate against groups or are at war and commit acts of violence that you are not protesting, or you are protesting, or you are against? But then we're talking about specific issues. When it's wholesale, it's so my short answer would be yes in some cases and no in some cases. Yeah, in the Twitter and social media, 140 characters, there's no space for that nuance and that debate, and that's where we are in this. Again, it's affirmation or rebuttal, and that's where we are. You have it.
But the anti-Semitism that we feel in the United States, it's not government sanctioned or not publicly government sanctioned. And the Catholics up until 1964 felt the same way. They couldn't get into public office or higher. And this was a white Protestant country.
Yeah.
But it's not government oriented. It's personal. I can't explain it.
Yeah. No,
But I hope that it's not government and that it never will be in this country.
No, and you're right, and that's well, until 1964, the Civil Rights Act, the discrimination was...
1960, JFK was elected.
Right, but discrimination was allowed, right? So there were places where there were covenants, no Jews allowed, right? You couldn't buy property in certain parts of certain cities and so on and so forth.
But that's why we were nomadic, even in this country, till the 50s, where we didn't buy houses till the 50s.
Right, so the point is, there were elements even within the United States laws and legal system that allowed for discrimination against different groups. Since the Civil Rights Act, it's not allowed. We don't know where it will go, right? We don't know where things will go. But you are right that there is no sort of in the Kristallnacht kind of sponsored violence that we see it. But that is a culmination of a process. That's not the beginning of the process, right? It starts at this personal level, it's this acceptance. From microaggressions to, personal bigotry to all kinds of things. And I don't know where it will go. We don't know where we will go because
I sure hope for my grandchildren's sake.
But we are living in a very scary moment in the world in general with lots of violence.
Professor Teter, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. There was so much in there. I want to thank you for bringing religion into the public sphere discussion and in scholarship. I myself am a scholar that's worked on the Protestant side. And I think we don't talk about this enough, how these ideas are embedded in culture, even if American culture is broadly speaking, even if certain voices feel more free to speak their religious viewpoints. Secularism is more pronounced now in the United States. It's not quite gone the same direction as Europe, but certainly we're kind of on that path a little bit. So I was wondering if you could sort of comment on, here's the tough part,
Okay.
you can see where I'm going with this, the sort of white Christian nationalism in the United States, and are there sort of even amongst the sort of less religious portions of American society, some hints of these ideas from back in medieval Europe?
Yes, that's a great question. So first of all, I think it's important to always have religion in place. So that's another problem with the scholarship on anti-Semitism, that it tried to separate anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism as two different things. And that hostility against Jews and Judaism was never lost. And to be frankly honest with you, the book that I ended up writing, the last one on Christian supremacy, reckoning with with the roots of anti-Semitism and racism, was kind of an intervention because I heard all this white supremacy language, and I was like, wait, you forget the Christian part. Right, in this way, and certainly Charlottesville, that became very clear that it's white and Christian at the same time. So I think it is very important. Now, the other part of the question was
just sort of tying those things together. Those antecedents in Europe, you see those?
Oh yeah, the antecedents in Europe. Yeah, no, I think that's why in my book I discussed the roots, because their roots are not necessarily causes, but they develop these ideas of superiority that emerges in the notion of superiority, Christian superiority over Judaism, then Christian domination through law over. And once Europe expands, it's now European domination over other groups. So but that Christian identity is not lost, right? And it was one of the scholars I was teaching in my class recently noted that Jews are, although often thought as scapegoats, they are more often spearheads. That is, their laws and ideas are kind of tried out first or created, and then they're applied to other areas. And we certainly see it through this process. I mean, it's not like a conscious thing. Oh, well, let's try it out on Jews and see what happens. But because Jews are a minority and have always been a minority everywhere, and that's the kind of way of thinking through these processes. So, Laura, to your question about how teaching, I think, to make students realize that Jews are always and have always been a minority, and the only place on earth where they are not is Israel right now. But otherwise, and we have to think about that in those minority terms.
Thank you so much. One final question for you, which is, what are the implications, since we're standing in a Holocaust education center, what are the implications of thinking about anti-Semitism and its historical antecedents, I never got that word right, in this moment where the conversation around anti-Semitism is fused with Israel and with all the other issues that are going on in our world?
Wow, that's a heavy and tough question. I will always say that we know how the story ends, right? So that's when we see some mechanisms or some echoes. Again, history doesn't repeat itself. History is different. But we know how this story, how it was manifested, and that kind of should raise some, alarms when we see certain things, because we know how it can escalate, how it can co-opt people. As this Polish philosopher, writer wrote, about the kind and gentle people, right? Who are just living there, and they don't, they may joke something, but then they might be drawn into that. So I think it's important to call it out early, not wait till the thing. And I think one of the problems with the weight of the Holocaust, that it diminishes the kind of feeling how you feel now, right? Because people think anti-Semitism is the Holocaust, and it doesn't take seriously. It lets people minimize the other kind of manifestations of anti-Semitism in the daily life and daily encounters. So, thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Dr. Teter. We're really, really grateful for you sharing so freely of your time and your insight, for joining us here in person at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, and to all of you who have joined us online. Thank you very much. We hope you stay safe and be well. Thanks.